That was the Shins singing Sea Legs. And this is The Wild Side on Source 96.1 FM, and I'm your host, Kight. And today we're not talking about the sea in general, which might have been suggested by that song, because that's a topic we've covered recently. You might have listened to that a couple of weeks ago. Instead, we're going to be talking about one species that lives in the sea, or in fact one group of species, one type of animal. And these are the corals. And I am talking about corals today because I've been reading a lot about them in some literature that I've been studying in order to do some lecturing up at the University of Exeter. And I realized as I was reading about these guys in a conservation management kind of perspective that I didn't actually know much about them as animals all by themselves. Where do they come from? What do they do? How are they interesting other than, just forming the reefs that we all know about? And so I did a little bit of research over the weekend in order to find out more about these organisms. And I thought that actually they are quite interesting animals, and you probably never would have guessed all the funny little things about their life histories. So I thought I might share all of these facts with you guys. So first of all, as I've already said, corals are animals. And this is something that was known as early as the 11th century. An Uzbekistani scholar named Al-Biruni was able to correctly identify these guys as being animals instead of plants. And in fact, people did think that they were plants even long after Al-Biruni made his observations. But this was finally disproven in the 18th century because someone named William Herschel had a microscope, and he was able to view them under a microscope and see that their cellular structure and their cellular materials were much more similar to those of animals than of plants. And in fact, these guys are in the phylum Cnidaria. And Cnidaria are interesting because they are not only corals but also sea anemones and jellyfish, so there's quite a whole lot of range of these different species that fall together within this phylum. And collectively the Cnidaria are quite an old group, so fossils go back 500 to 600 million years ago to the Cambrian period, when there was a whole lot of diversification happening and lots of different species emerging. And interestingly, despite the fact that this phylum is quite diverse, all of these species have several different things in common, which is of course why they're grouped together in this phylum. So for example, they all possess cnidocytes, which are specialized cells that are used for capturing prey. And they also all have two different body forms. So they have a swimming variety that's known as a medusa because of the way that it has kind of a main body with lots of little tentacles, like the Medusa figure of legend. And also they have a polyp form that is sessile, which means that it doesn't go anywhere, it just sits still. And actually, despite the fact that it has just these two different varieties that it forms throughout its life, any sort of cnidarian will have a very complex life cycle that can involve multiple different body parts and different sexualities at different times. It can reproduce sexually, but it can also have some asexual reproduction and form multiples of itself. So there's quite a lot going on with these organisms. Now all of these guys also have just a single orifice and body cavity that's used for both digestion and respiration. So at one point they'll kind of eat and then go through the process of digestion, and when they're all done, they'll spit out, basically through their mouth, whatever is left over. They also have activities that are coordinated by a decentralized nerve net, and they have very simple receptors. And this is something that might surprise you if you've ever watched some of these organisms for very long, because they can seem to be kind of clever and quite smart about how they interact with other animals and respond to the changing environment around them. But actually they do have quite a simple nerve system. And corals are just one example of the way in which these animals might often form colonies of lots of different individuals living together. So they seem to like to kind of clump together, and you see this especially also with sea anemones and with jellyfish. You have those giant groups that you might wander into when you're out swimming or snorkeling somewhere. Now in general, cnidarians cover the globe, but corals themselves are predominantly found in warm, shallow marine waters, though there are some exceptions to this, which I'll mention a bit later. So corals themselves are in a class called Anthozoa, and these organisms don't have a medusa stage during their development, like some of the other species in the phylum. Instead, what they do is the adults release their sperm and their eggs externally, and these guys will join up together and form a larval body that's known as a planula. So this is a strange little structure that's free-swimming, it's flattened, it's very symmetrical, and it has little cilia that allow it to move around. So it's basically a little embryo that can swim around on its own. And eventually, after it does this for a while, it will attach to a substrate and then grow into an adult polyp. And it will have an elongated form, basically, once it's reached its mature stage, where it has one end that's attached to the substrate and then the other end that acts as its mouth, and the mouth is surrounded by tentacles that it uses to capture food particles and eat. And the name Anthozoa actually means flower animal, and it refers to the fact that these organisms can look quite floral when they're polyps, and that's why for a very long time people did think that they were more likely to be plants than animals. Now, if you're interested in corals specifically, which of course we are today, you have to look a bit deeper in the class of Anthozoa, and you have to look at two main subclasses. And these are the guys that cover corals. So corals come in two types, one for each subclass. You've got your hermatypic corals and your ahermatypic corals. And the first type are the stony corals that we know of for building reefs. And these guys form symbiotic relationships with photosynthetic microalgae that are known as zooxanthellae, or zooxanthellae, depending on how you want to pronounce it. So each of these guys tends to harbor only one species of these microalgae, although throughout its lifetime, an individual polyp can expel one group of these symbionts and then pull in another instead. So they can swap, but at any given time, they're likely to only have one. And this is a nice relationship for both of these guys. It's a mutualism because the polyps tend to harbor, the algae in the polyps tend to have a nice place to live, and they are nice and safe in there. They're not swimming around and being eaten by things in the water. And they are able to consume carbon dioxide and nitrogenous waste that's produced by the coral itself, whereas the polyps are able to take advantage of the fact that here they are living in proximity to these algae that are able to photosynthesize. And when they photosynthesize, the algae can pass on glucose and glycerol and amino acids and all sorts of other nice things that will help the coral do better. And they actually can produce up to 90% of the coral's energy requirements, just these little algae that live within them. And also, the algae are responsible for the coloration that we see in the corals. So if you ever see pictures of really deep sea corals that aren't forming relationships with algae and having that kind of photosynthetic activity, you'll notice that they're really pale and quite white. And that's because it's the algae that give these nice colors. So on their own, the algae tend to be kind of brownish, but then they will contribute reds and blues and greens from the materials that they produce that are taken up by the corals that then make these nicer, kind of prettier colors on their own. Now, even though this is a mutualistic relationship, and the corals do tend to do quite well because of this, the algae can also be tough tenants. So they can sometimes take a little bit more than the corals are able to give, and so it's not quite an even exchange of nice materials. And when that happens, the polyps will every now and then eject them when they're stressed about. And that's something that I'll talk more about later, because when they are stressed and they do eject their algae, this is something that's called bleaching. And bleaching can be a sign that there's something going on in the environment. And that's why when you hear a lot of news coverage about what's happening to coral reefs, people will talk about how there are bleaching events that are an indication of the fact that these guys are in trouble and need some conservation help. And really the reason that the polyps do this is that they can survive better over the short term, because they're not donating any of their energy to the algae, so they can kind of go into emergency mode and shut down a little bit and take care of themselves. And then when they're feeling a bit better, when the environment is a bit better off, they can form relationships all over again, take in some new algae, and then kind of pick up where they left off. And unfortunately, if they can't do this, or if they don't do this for some reason or another, they usually end up dying. Now, what we know of as coral reefs are really just aggregations of calcium carbonate that is secreted by the polyps. And this over time will form a hard skeleton. So they secrete this kind of at their base, and it will build up over time and kind of crack and maybe fall off a bit, and just kind of make little plates that rise up and up and up and give substrate to other animals to settle on and live on. And so of course the more substrate there is, the more other polyps might eventually settle there and grow up, and so you have these coral colonies that grow larger and larger over time. Now, as I said, there's a second type of coral, another subclass, and these guys are the ahermatypic corals, and they have no zooxanthellae. And what they do is basically they feed for themselves. So like the other corals, they will eat phytoplankton that are swimming by in the environment, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in detail later. But they have to do this all on their own. All of their proteins are coming from their own hard work and not from the algae. And so they have to have lots of tentacles that are able to help them with their feeding and help them be quite efficient at getting all these foods out of the environment. They also tend to be very flexible, and they undulate in the current, and they often will look very lacy because of all of this movement and all of these tentacles. And that again is helping them. The more they move around, the more the water rushes past them, and they kind of flow with it. They're able to come in contact with their phytoplankton so they can pick up all the energy and nutrients that they need out of the water. And these guys have skeletons of protein rather than of calcium, and that's of course because they're getting a different type and amount of nutrients out of their environment compared to the other types of corals. And these guys do also tend to be quite a bit less common. So for example, if you look at the Caribbean environment only, there tend to be about 20 different species of hermatypic corals, 20 species of ahermatypic corals versus about 50 species of hermatypic corals. So it's the coral reef variety that is much more common than the kind that lives kind of in these colder, harsher environments a bit deeper down in the sea. And that was Ingrid Michaelson singing In the Sea. That's off of her new album. And today we are talking about one group of organisms that live in the sea, and that is the corals. So I've already talked a little bit about the families that corals find themselves in, and the phylum and the class and all of that kind of hardcore scientific background. So now I'll move on to more of the fun stuff and talk about coral anatomy. So if you've ever seen pictures of corals or seen videos of them in nature documentaries, you'll know that coral reefs tend to look really colorful. There's a lot going on. They come in all shapes and sizes. And that's because the coral heads come in many forms. And the heads are what we see whenever we look at a reef and we see all of those lots of little polyps living together. So some of them look like little wrinkly brains, others kind of have a staghorn shape, others are spiral and kind of look like DNA almost, others are just straight up and down and are like pillars. So they come in all sorts of shapes and formations. And as I mentioned, what we see is a single head, so maybe that entire kind of staghorn formation, that entire long column or pillar of coral, that's actually lots of different polyps that are genetically identical. It's not one single organism. And if you look closely, what you'll see is all the little single polyps sitting there by themselves with their little tentacles up. And each one of those little sets of tentacles is a single polyp. And every polyp is only a few millimeters in diameter, so they are actually quite small. And what happens is that, I mentioned already that we have these things called the planula, and they will sit down on a substrate and grow up into adults once they have found a good place to live. And once they have grown up into adults, the adults will eventually kind of bud off and form asexual buds, and then those buds will grow up, and that will form a head eventually, because they'll have lots of these budding events until there are many of them all growing together. And you can actually have this happen in one of two ways. First, you can have a little one that buds off of the adult and then grows up until it's the same size as the adult. Or you can have two similarly sized, basically adults, coming from the same original polyp. So the polyp will basically just split in half into two individuals like itself. And multiple of these polyps can interconnect, so they aren't just growing, budding off and growing up together for no reason at all. They actually do quite well when they work together, and so that's why they're doing all of this asexual budding. They'll join up their gastrovascular canals, and this allows them to share nutrients and share symbiotes and kind of weather the environmental conditions together. So it's kind of the same thing that happens when you see maybe a flock of animals or a herd of animals kind of working together to look out for predators or to find a good food resource. So it's just kind of a different variation on that theme of lots of individuals kind of working together in order to accomplish something. Now, when the corals are stressed out by the environment, they can contract their tentacles and dip down into that skeletal platform I mentioned. I said that they were secreting the calcium kind of at their base, and so this kind of eventually forms a little cup that they can draw themselves down into whenever things are dangerous, and by withdrawing their tentacles and dipping down, they can pretty much make themselves inaccessible to predators and to anything else that's in the environment. So maybe if there are some really rough waves or some sort of sand that's blowing around in the water, anything that might come up against them and hurt them in some way, they can contract themselves and try to get away from that. Now they also have kind of a more hardcore defense, so they possess these stinging cells, and that's what I mentioned earlier at the beginning. And these cells contain venom that can be rapidly delivered to any intruder that comes along and tries to hurt these guys. And these cells are called cnidocysts or nematocysts, and they're in the ends of the tentacles, and this allows them to defend themselves if there are, for instance, fish that come along and try to graze on them because they think they look tasty. Now the exoskeleton of these guys is formed by a combination of things. So first you've got the aragonite, which comes from polyps, and then you've got calcium, which comes from the seawater. And amazingly, this can actually grow as much as 10 grams per square meter of polyp per day. So this can be, really fast growing. And actually, if you think about it, they have to be quite fast growing because they're always being subjected to the movement of the waves and of the ocean around them and of things that might be in the waves coming up and banging up against them. There are also going to be some fish and other organisms that will come and nibble on the reefs themselves. And so they have to be able to grow quite quickly in order to withstand all of the stuff that's trying to wear them down from the outside. And the speed with which they're able to do this is going to depend on what type of species we're talking about, and also the light conditions, because they do depend on energy from the light, which of course they're allowed to get this energy from their symbionts. And they depend on that in order to have enough energy to grow. And so the more light there is, the more they're going to grow in response to anything around them in the environment, kind of whittling them down. Now actually, even though these guys are kind of sitting still, and you wouldn't think that anything that's completely still would have much behavior, they do have some really interesting things that they do. So one of the most basic things, of course, is feeding, and these guys can feed on things of all sizes. So amazingly, this goes from phytoplankton all the way up to small fish, and that's because, of course, they can use this venom that they have to kind of knock things out, and so they're able to consume larger things than you might imagine when you first look at them. And they can also scavenge on whatever molecules happen to be drifting past. So some molecules are going to be on the size of these little plankton, or not much smaller. And by being able to pull these little tiny things out of the habitat, they're able to capitalize on whatever energy they can find, because some of these places that they live don't actually have that much going on, and so they have to be able to eat whatever nutrients they can get their hands on. And actually, coral are predominantly nocturnal feeders, which is kind of interesting. So basically you've got the algae being active at day when they're being photosynthetic, and then the corals are active at night, and so these guys do form quite a nice partnership to take advantage of all 24 hours of the day. And as I said, they immobilize or kill their prey with the venom in their nematocysts, and then their tentacles grab onto the prey and contract and drag the prey down into the stomach. And they remain closed off like that for quite a while they're digesting. And once they finish that up, the stomach will open back up again, and they'll expel the waste back out through that same hole. Because as I said, they only have the single orifice in which everything comes and goes. Now, during the breeding season, and I've already mentioned breeding a little bit, where they have this external breeding event, many of the colonies on a single reef will spawn simultaneously, and that's because they really need to ensure reproductive success. And animals like this that send their gametes, their sperm and their eggs, out into the environment, they do have to try to coordinate things really carefully, because if you have some individuals going on one day and another individuals going on another, then the gametes might not meet up in the environment and they might not fertilize, and then you don't have any sort of egg forming that little planula that will go settle down somewhere. And so they seem to use a variety of cues in order to figure out, when is my neighbor going to breed so that I can breed as well. And this seems to be a kind of a mixture of fluctuations in the temperature, changes in the lunar cycle, day length, because obviously that's a sign of season, and also potentially some chemicals that they may release in order to signal to each other that they're ready to spawn. Now they all tend to spawn at night, and so of course the thing that precedes nighttime is the sunset, and so sunset then is a very useful cue to signal not only is it the right time of year to breed, but it's also the right time of day. And I've mentioned the planulae now a couple times, the fertilized eggs, And once they form, they don't just immediately go settle somewhere. They first have to grow up a little bit, and to do this, they have a couple days all the way up to a couple of months. And so what they tend to do is exhibit phototaxis, which means that they are moving towards the light. So as soon as the planulae will form, they will then show these phototactic abilities and swim towards the surface of the ocean. And they drift there for a while, during which time they grow and become stronger, take on their nutrients, get into the right shape. And once they've done this enough, they're going to dive themselves back down and find a good place to attach to a surface. Now, of course, if these guys are just floating around up in waves, they could go anywhere in that time, those couple days or those couple months. And so they might end up finding themselves in a place that actually is not good for a coral at all. And what they then do is they switch over and they exhibit sonotaxis, and this means that they are moving towards sounds. And specifically, they cue in on sounds that are emanated by a reef. And you might wonder what sort of sound a reef would make. Well, basically, a reef is kind of a combination of all the sounds of the organisms that live on it, and also the water that's moving around it. And so you tend to have sounds associated with the waves or the lack thereof, depending on where exactly these habitats are. You have little shrimp that might make clicking sounds. Fish often will make kind of booming sounds, or they'll expel air and make kind of little puffy sounds. And so there are all sorts of things that together make the sound of a reef. And actually reefs can be quite loud. And if you've ever dived or snorkeled, you might actually have noticed this. You can hear a whole lot of activity going on underneath the sea. And so these little, what are about to become polyps, they actually have kind of this innate ability to cue in on those sounds and find their way to a place that is a suitable site for them to sit down and attach themselves and then grow up. And actually this is why noise pollution is thought to potentially interfere with formation of new coral reefs, because they're not able to recruit their young as well as they used to be, because the young can't hear where they should go. And so they end up just kind of going out to sea or attaching themselves somewhere very unsuitable. And so human noise, things like boats and recreational boats, but also shipping boats, this can disrupt the process that these little guys use whenever they're finding their new home. And of course, as you might expect, it's not easy to be a little planula just floating along in the oceans. The corals, the parent corals, will release millions of gametes during any spawning event, but new colonies form at really low rates. So there's actually quite a low rate at which the fertilization occurs, and then another low rate at which the fertilized eggs will eventually sit down and form the new colony. So that's why coral reefs are something to really be valued, because they are quite hard to replace.